Yeah.
So, second.
There's anything in there.
All right, that's good. I didn't get to the juicy parts of my introduction. Cool. All right, thank you. All right, so our speaker today is Dustin Wax. Dustin is the executive director of the Burlesque Hall of Fame, a museum in downtown Las Vegas dedicated to preserving and sharing the art and history of burlesque. Alongside his various administrative duties, Wax works with museum staff, develops exhibits and other programs, produces special events, and preserves a collection of costumes, stage props, posters, photographs, and personal effects representing 150 years of burlesque history. So, a lot to do. Wax is also a cultural anthropologist by training, having completed his graduate coursework at the New School for Social Research in New York City, a very storied institution for those interested in the history of the discipline. I think Boaz, Margaret Mead, all those folks occasionally taught courses there. Lévi-Strauss, there you go, another big name. Since 2003, he has taught anthropology and gender studies at both the College of Southern Nevada and UNLV, so we're fortunate enough to count him among our various colleagues. In 2006, he founded the anthropology blog Savage Minds, which later renamed to Anthrodendum. The venerable peer-reviewed journal Science dubbed Savage Minds one of its top 20 science sites. And importantly, Savage Minds, now Anthrodendum, has become an important gathering place for anthropologists to share and debate ideas outside of formal academic publications and conference presentations. I would say, especially if you're a graduate student in anthropology and you're not checking Anthrodendum on a regular basis, do so, because it always has great, interesting think pieces. Their one right there now is about going to baseball and thinking with Leslie White, which if you never thought about Leslie White in baseball, it's a great opportunity to think those things together. Wax's academic work has ranged from Native American studies to the use of the social sciences and military counterinsurgency programs in Iraq and Afghanistan. And his principal interest in and exploration of the history of anthropology is reflected in his 2008 edited volume, Anthropology at the Dawn of the Cold War, The Influence of Foundations, McCarthyism, and the CIA. And for those of you, if you haven't had an opportunity to check out this volume, it's a really great illuminating series of essays concerning the ways that anthropology developed in the context of the Cold War, influenced by Cold War money, politics, and military power. And I really can't overstate the importance of this book enough, because really prior to the publication of this, in the literature on the history of US anthropology, if you were following it, it really was largely an early 20th century, if not a late 19th century area of inquiry. The relationship between the discipline and post-World War II geopolitical developments was something of a historical black box. And this became painfully noticeable with the rise of the War on Terror and the subsequent much debated Human Terrain System program. But along with folks such as David Price, Dustin's work really ushered in new and highly relevant vistas of self-reflexive critical disciplinary history. And it seemed like virtually every history of anthropology themed panel that I went to at the meetings last year had some reference to the Cold War backdrop, and appropriately Dustin's edited volume. For anthropologists, the attempt to historicize our discipline's many trajectories is often a kind of thankless task. Usually it doesn't win you awards or a whole lot of notoriety, and we don't always have the opportunity to thank people for their scholarship. So I'd like to take this opportunity to formally thank Dustin for the work that he's done in the Academy. And I also look forward to hearing more about the work that he's done in the museum with his talk today titled The Anthropologist in the Museum. So please join me and welcome me, Dustin Wax.
I would like to just make one real quick edit. I was a co-founder of Savage Minds. There were 6 of us. And the name, as the name change suggests, became kind of embarrassing. It was hilarious in 2006. It's a play on Les Pensées Sauvages, the Claude Lévi-Strauss book, which means savage minds, the mind of the savage. Also means wild pansies, which we used as our sort of our logo and graphics on the site. But there was also a time when Michael Savage was on MSNBC. He was like the right-wing blowhard guy on MSNBC, and would just have guests on and scream at them. And we're like, how funny would it be if we were like, we're just going to be like the anthropologists screaming our thoughts out, and everyone has to listen anyway. So we did change that when we realized, and increasingly got complaints that people were like, as an indigenous person, Savage has been used to really marginalize us for a long time and really hurt us. So anthro addendum is sort of what we came up with. My name is Dustin Wax. I am, as noted, an anthropologist who works primarily in museums and does not keep up very much with current anthropological literature anymore. The Burlesque Hall of Fame is downtown on Main Street, just north of Charleston Boulevard, and I highly recommend it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about my own background and how I came into the museum, what we do at the museum, a little bit about anthropology in museums, and then a little bit about museums themselves and sort of what are some of the roles in museums, some of the challenges. So if we have time, we'll get to all of that. It just works. Oh, maybe we lost focus again when unmuted. There we go. So this is me. As mentioned, I got my degree from New School for Social Research. That department fell apart in between 2000 and 2003, roughly, which was my years. And so by the time I was ready to write the dissertation, there was no one in the department. And by no one in the department, I mean, there was not no one I didn't know or I knew. There was no one in the department. And so they hired Pomeroff, I want to say, and she rebuilt the department. And then they were like, well, we'd love to have you finish up. All you have to do is come back and take all the core courses again, because we've changed the core curriculum. So I said, ABD sounds nice. And by then I was already I was working as a freelance writer. I was writing for pretty, it's how we ended up starting Savage Minds. There were a bunch of us that were blogging and writing for big sites. I was writing for magazine stuff, and I was like, the idea of going back into academic publishing and publishing for 12 readers when I have, I'm writing on sites that get 250,000 daily readers, felt a little weird. And felt like maybe that wasn't the kind of influence I wanted to have in the world. So I still did some academic work. My book was published, in 2008, and still work with Savage Minds, published some other reviews and stuff here and there, but and a couple of articles, but mostly by 2010, I was working in museums. My research was on the Fox project. My dissertation was going to be, and it was going to be great. On the Fox project, which is the University of Chicago, anthropology department had this graduate program in Iowa among the Meskwaki Indians, who are also called the Fox Indians, hence the name, and in the 50s, and they had come up with, they went out to this very economically depressed community and were like, well, we need to help, but we don't want to just be like, whatever the, Salvation Army or whatever coming in and telling everyone to straighten up and fly right. So how do we help within the cultural context of this community? And they developed a program that they called Action Anthropology, which is still used today, but it's a form of engaged anthropology. It's really looking at what are the problems that people in the community identify for themselves? What are the resources that they identify? And so the anthropologist's job is to sort of elicit that rather than to tell them, hey, the old joke, if you just collected tarot all day, you wouldn't be lying around on the beach all the time. While I was in graduate school, I got into museums working at the Jewish Museum. And I always thought, this is really cool. Like, we'd have researchers and anthropologists and writers and sociologists and art historians or whatever come in for meetings and be involved with curating an exhibition. I thought, that seems like a really cool job. I want this to be part of my career as like a sideline. But I'm sorry. So I started taking some museum studies courses, which we didn't have at the new school, but in New York, all the graduate schools are part of this consortium. You can take classes at any of them. So I took classes at NYU's museum studies program and went off to do my dissertation research, both doing archival research in the National Anthropology Archives at the Smithsonian, and then doing field work, pretty poor field work in Iowa. And by poor, not so much because I didn't know what I was doing, although I didn't. I mean, who does? But because I ran headlong into a problem that had already been documented, which is nobody likes talking to anthropologists. By the time we're around, if this was 1950, 1948, when my people were working, that I was researching, then they could just be there. People are like, great, there's another bunch of white folk come to ask us a bunch of questions. But in 2002 and 2003, it was more like, and this is what finally, after putting me off for months, the one woman that was central to, she had been basically the house mom of this house that the University of Chicago bought that all these students lived in. And so she was the primary person. And every time I called her to interview her, she was like, oh, I'm just going to Walmart with my grandkids and, I'll be back in a few hours. And I call in a few hours. She's like, oh, I'm doing such and such and come back tomorrow. And I'd come back tomorrow. Oh, we're just doing this and whatever. She kept putting me off. And finally she said, oh, you anthropologists, you come out here, you come out here and you take and you take and you take, and what do you give back? And I had a give back plan because I had been doing web design for several years at that point, also, because why not? And I thought, well, I'll go out there and I'll teach. They have a K-8 school on their settlement. And so I thought, well, I'll teach web design and I can do projects where they can share their stories and teach these kids a skill that is going to be useful as they, in 2002, not everyone knew how to do it. You didn't have drag and drop. We didn't really have blog software yet. So I get out there, and of course, the reason they have a K-8 school is because they have a fairly successful casino, and they're one of the only tribes that owns their casino, rather than basically borrowing a ton of money from a big casino company that then comes out, builds that casino, and then manages it for 20 years until the casino's paid off. So they own theirs, and they were pumping that money back into the community. And so I get out there and I go to meet the IT guy at the school, and I'm like, hey, I'd love to teach these classes or whatever. And he's like, oh yeah, we already teach web design in grades 6, 7, and 8. So I was there to take and had nothing to give back. I came out here to write up my dissertation, and in some misbegotten belief that someone would show up in my school to be a graduate dissertation advisor, and I started teaching at CSN. A couple of years later, I started teaching here in the Women's Studies department when there still was one, and was doing that up until I started working at the Barrack Museum in 2010. I was still teaching at Women's Studies until that department was dissolved in 2011, I believe. And had also started, while I was teaching Women's Studies, I had met the former director of the museum, who had been a copywriter who had come out to write a story for Bust magazine on the museum when it was still in California, which I will tell a little bit more of that history in a minute. And when there were really bad storms in 2004 and 5 that wrecked some of the buildings, they moved the collection out here to put it in storage. And she ended up sort of becoming the executive director in that interim period, originally to be just for a little bit, but that interim period stretched out for several years by the time I met her. And she was like, oh, you're studying women's studies, you're looking at all these, feminist issues and blah, blah, blah. You should really look into burlesque. And I was like, oh, and then maybe I'll go down to the newsstand and talk to the newsboy, like it's 1934. And she's like, no, there's this whole like revival. Burlesque is this really big thing. So she started getting getting me into it. And in 2010, she started working on opening this tiny little space in what was the Emergency Arts Center, or they were turning. It's the old J.C. Penney's building, which had been turned into a medical center, which had then closed, and they were turning this medical center into an arts space, so that all the exam rooms, little tiny rooms, would become like little artist studio / galleries. And we had the nurses station, which is 200 and some square feet. And she's like, would you like to help us? And I was like, sure. There were only like 4 museums here at the time. None of the big museums here, the Neon Museum, Mom Museum, the State Museum was a tiny little space over in Lorenzo State Park. The Atomic Test Site Museum, none of those had opened yet. And so I had kind of put this to the side that I would ever be working in museums, and I was just kind of trying to figure out where I was going. Well, like I said, I was freelance writing and doing other stuff. And teaching, and she asked me to help, and I was like, sure, I want to get involved in the museum. And it just happened that like a couple months later, there was the opening at the Barrack Museum. Well, as I started taking all the stuff I'd learned in my classes and my previous experience and putting it to work at the Barrack, I started realizing there were we were falling short in a lot of ways of the Burlesque Hall of Fame. So I started asking her, can I curate a new exhibition that has like more of a focused educational value? Can I help with this? Can I help with that? And eventually the plan had been to open this small space to kind of build towards opening a larger space. And eventually she asked me, would I write a 5-year plan for getting into this larger space? And we had this big summit, a bunch of stakeholders and board members, and I presented the plan, and then they asked me to become the executive director and institute that plan, which ended up taking 7 years instead of 5 years, but it didn't happen. So we are now downtown on Main Street in sort of 3,000 square foot space. I've always loved museums. Since I was a kid, and we used to travel. I grew up in the Midwest. My dad's work involved covering 6 states. So in the summer, we'd all pile into the back of the station wagon and we'd go work with him. Basically, he'd go on in the daytime and do his work, and we'd explore whatever, Kearney, Nebraska, or Rapid City, South Dakota, or wherever we happened to be. And I was always like dragging everyone into museums. In the 6th grade, we had a field trip to the University of Nebraska State Museum, which is in Lincoln. I grew up in Omaha, and I always remember this baluchit there, which is a kind of a rhino, an extinct rhino. They're the largest land mammals that have ever land mammals, by the way, that have ever walked the earth. And I remember seeing him there. And I went looking for information a couple of years back, and I discovered that they had ended up getting rid of it because it was entirely stuffed with asbestos. And like 2 years after I left, they were like, maybe we shouldn't have all these kids tromping around in this giant asbestos thing, shooting out dust everywhere. So, but yeah, one of these kids could be me. That was our 6th grade field trip. I don't know, maybe we weren't quite that small, but that's my formative memory of like, oh, this is like cool. You could do this. And I worked at a bunch. I worked at the National Gallery in London. which is not really a museum job because I worked in the pret-a-manger sandwich shop in the basement, but I did get to, when I took the trash out, walk through the sort of backstage area and see where they were restoring paintings or had giant like x-rays of paintings up, taped on the wall so they could study them and stuff like that. I then worked at the Church Museum as an administrative assistant to the director for the program division, which is all your exhibitions, your special events, the collection management and all that. And that was where, like I said, I kind of started really getting the idea that this could be a actual part of my career, not just a thing that I like doing. Then my fellowship at the Smithsonian, when I was working in the National Anthropology Archives, you have to have a sponsor for this fellowship. And so I was sponsored by anthropologists at the American Museum of Natural History, was attached there. And then, of course, like I said, the Barrett Museum right here. So since 2011, I've been the director. Since 2010, I've been a volunteer at the Burlesque Hall of Fame. This is our space now. We have this lovely green box in front of it, so we can't ever have like just a beautiful picture like the one of the Barrett Museum on the last slide. We're a small museum. Our budget this year is about $500,000, $510,000, most of which pays our rent and payroll. We have this space where we give tours, which are super well received. We do a visit is a tour. Basically, the tour is our core experience. And we talk about the history of burlesque from around the time of the Civil War to the present. Burlesque as an art form has existed. It's a form of theater that's existed since there's been theater. We consider Aristophanes, Lysistrata to be, one of the earliest burlesques. In that sense, it's a kind of parody through exaggeration of regular theater. Pyramus and Thisbe, the play within a play in Midsummer's Night Dream, is a burlesque. A lot of Chaucer's writings were burlesques. A lot of authors wrote books explicitly called burlesque, and they were just parodies of other stories. Mark Twain wrote a book of burlesque. Thackeray wrote a book of burlesque. So that was a pretty well-established literary form by the time it sort of hits in America in the 1860s, just after the Civil War. And so we talk about that sort of history and what set burlesque apart as it moved from this kind of theatrical parody, where in a lot of cases women played the men's roles, which was really weird for audiences in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, especially because they typically wore men's profession costumes, but they would wear them with tights and often some degree of decolletage. So they were clearly women playing men's roles, and it made men feel all like attracted to, repulsed, like they have all this weird feelings inside. And it gave it a lot of energy. It became a hugely popular form of entertainment in this kind of theatrical format. And I'll talk a little bit about where the history goes from there when I get to that slide. But this is a shot of the museum, another shot of the museum. As I mentioned, we were based in Hellendale, California. So I'll give you a little history of the museum, I guess. The collection was started by a woman named Jenny Lee. And Jenny Lee was an exotic dancer in the 50s who started they had a union. They had the American Guild of Variety Artists, which is still a going union, but they weren't doing anything for exotic dancers, even though in a lot of cities, exotic dancers were 85 to 90% of their membership. But they weren't really, they were strippers. And so they weren't really giving them a lot of attention. So she started the Exotic Dancers League in 1955 in LA to agitate for better working conditions, better wages, heaters in their dressing rooms, some degree of professional limitations, so that a lot of places would just put they had a serving, women who were serving, and they just throw them up on stage and have them do an act. They're like, no, there's a degree of professionalism. We're trained to do this. We know what we're doing. And a lot of places had prostitution. And essentially they were, the gals on stage were wares for sale, right? The idea being that, you know, then that would get the guys all hot and bothered, and then they would go about back. So there's a lot of mob involvement. And in LA, they didn't allow that. It's called bee drinking. The idea is, I mean, it's exactly what you do in a strip club today. You move around and find someone and then sit with them. You know, they order drinks for you. You throw the drinks away secretly, you know, and they keep ordering drinks, and then you do a, you know, a lap dance or a private room or whatever. Like, it's the same idea, except the mob was running it. So instead of just going to a private room and having a dance where you're not allowed to touch each other, you have the kind of dance where you do touch each other. And so that was sort of what she was fighting against. In 1965, for their annual meeting, she says, hey, everyone bring pictures and stuff, and we'll start a Burlesque Hall of Fame. And then she displayed that collection in her nightclub in San Pedro, California for a long time under terrible museum conditions. Eventually she goes to nightclubs, she's displaying them in her home for a while. But she had breast cancer in the late 70s. She was diagnosed, so she moved out to the desert, the high desert in Hallandale. They had a goat ranch that was in her husband's family, and reestablished there. And she had her Jenny Lee School of Striptease, and she started putting this museum together. But she got sicker and sicker. She couldn't do it. She had her friend Dixie Lee, who was also an exotic dancer in the 50s and 60s. She was the Marilyn Monroe of Burlesque. She was did a Marilyn Monroe act, impersonation act, and she'd become a nurse assistant in her, you know, after that career. She came out to sort of nurse her. She died Jenny Lee died in 1991. Dixie took over, and Dixie really finished the museum. She started this event we still have today, the Miss Exotic World Pageant, which has now grown into the Beehoff Weekender. It's a 4-day event that we have at the Orleans every year, to attract attention. And so, like I said, when the storm hit in 2004 and blew the roof in, basically, it was no longer safe to keep the museum there. But Dixie had like just walls like this, just walls of pictures and cheap frames. And I don't know if you can see so much in the picture, but you can see like, this is like yellow construction paper that she's cut out and put around it. There's like stuff, there's like a gemstone that she's, you know, just glued onto this picture. She had these little stars made with their names hand painted on them, little clay stars, and she put them on. There's a lot of craftsy elements to it. We tried to, as you saw in the previous picture, you know, I'm trying to have, you know, we have a timeline and we have a tour, we have sections. But for her, we tried to preserve the folksy elements of that Hallandale as part of the history, because what happened is a lot of her, as the burlesque revival came along, a lot of performers would go out there for this competition, for this Miss Exotic World competition, and they met the previous generation of performers, the Tempest Storms and the April March and all these, you know, other older dancers, and it kind of became a way that this knowledge was passed on and became really important to the fact that burlesque, to the ability of burlesque to return as an art form that people, you know, could actually, you know, do and develop in the 90s. So that's an important part of the history. We tried to really capture that feeling of it. We also do temporary exhibits. This was one we did last year on Kobe Yee. Kobe Yee owned the Forbidden, Forbidden Planet was the word that came to my mind. It's not, it's a Forbidden City, which is an Asian nightclub in San Francisco. It was sort of the core of the rebuilt touristy Chinatown that was that she had taken over. It was actually started by another guy named I can't remember his first name, his last name was Lowe. And she ran it while she also worked as a costumer, while she also ran a school teaching striptease and dance, and while she also performed. So in a lot of nights, and she also had her another nightclub in the same area. And a lot of nights she would work as an MC at one nightclub and perform at the other and run back and forth. So she earned the sort of nickname the hardest working woman in Chinatown. And when she passed away a couple of years ago, and her daughter donated a bunch of her costumes, which, as I said, she was a costumer, so she did all these amazing costumes. So we built an exhibition. There's some of the stuff that was on display. So I already talked a little bit about what is burlesque, but this is Lydia Thompson. She's the one who came over in 1865 in 1868 from England and brought that kind of theatrical burlesque to America. And what we have is a moment where the Civil War is like a big dividing line in American history, where we're moving from a rural agrarian society to an urban society. Before the Civil War, minstrelsy was the show. That was the entertainment. Theater was also huge. Theater, I didn't know this until I worked at the museum. I did some research, but we had way more theaters per capita than any other country in the world by the 1840s. But this kind of burlesque where you're wearing, like I said, the tights that are showing off your legs. It's hard to see in this picture, but the tiniest little bit of décolletage. That was new. And it was topical. They'd often, ad-lib the script to reference, things that were happening at the time. She came over to do a parody play called Ixion, which is a parody of Greek mythology. There's the character of Ixion in Greek mythology. And she had a 6-month engagement at, ironically, at a museum. But museums at that time, the sort of dime museums, were these kind of half P.T. Barnum sideshow, half theatrical spectacle kind of places. And the show was so huge that they had to move into a legitimate Broadway theater, which was a huge furor because she moved from a working class theater into a middle class theater, and now all of a sudden the middle class was going to be exposed to this war of women in tights, and so the uproar was so big that 6-month tour ended up getting sent to a 6-year tour of the United States, and she made a ton of money. And that her troupe was called the British Blondes, Lydia Thompson and her British Blondes. That became a kind of, just like Kleenex means tissue, British Blondes meant this kind of burlesque. So that became huge. And then that guy's Tigger. He is an active performer right now. And as you can see, very much the modern burlesque has a lot of performance art in it. It has a lot of, we have men in it, for one thing, which wasn't super true throughout most of burlesque. In the theatrical period, there were men on, acting, but in the striptease period, there weren't a lot of male striptease artists. This is where it all comes together for me. I've taught body ritual among the Nazarima for 20 years now, and everyone who's taught in this class has taught it, and everyone who's taking anthropology has probably read it. There's a line in it: a few women afflicted with an almost inhuman hyper-memory development are so idolized that they make a handsome living simply going from village to village and permitting the natives to stare at them for a fee. That's burlesque. He wrote this in the 1950s. That was Tempest Storm, whose hyper memory development was insured by Lloyd's of London for $1 million. And she advertised it prominently because you were going to get to see breasts that were worth insuring for $1 million. So that was a big draw. Tempest Storm performed here quite a bit. She dated Elvis for a little bit. She dated Sammy Davis Jr. for a little bit. Jerry Lewis for a little bit. She eventually married the saxophone player from not Duke Ellington's band, from one of the big bands. His name is Herb Jeffries. He was Black, she was not. He had a big recording contract. She had just signed a contract to make movies, and both the studios told each of them, if you go through with this, you will lose your contract. They went through with it. They lost their contract. She had to rebuild her career, which she did. But anyway, it's just yet another circle comes complete that I end up working in a field that was probably mentioned in the very first anthropology article I ever read, back when I took Anth 101 at Miracosta Community College in San Diego. This is another poster of, where again you see these costumes where they're dressed in military costumes, but they have skirts instead of pants, and you can see their legs. This is Gypsy Rose Lee, the probably most famous burlesque performer, largely because of the play and the movie. But she got started in the late 20s, which was right when striptease started happening. So you couldn't be nude on a stage before that. Or you could be nude, but you couldn't be nude and move. They would do these tableau vivants where people would take a pose and then they'd open the curtain and then they would have costumed actors moving about, but there'd be nudes, because a nude woman is art. So long as she doesn't move or say anything, that's fantastic. But as soon as she moves, it's filthy. And so by the late 20s, striptease had been introduced into burlesque. And by the time, which was right exactly when she started, which was exactly when radio and talking movies became popular and killed variety theater, except for burlesque. And burlesque survived because they had developed striptease, and you could see that on the radio, certainly. That doesn't make it for good radio. And you couldn't see it in the movie theaters. Movies very quickly after this period, because now they become middle-class entertainment, so just working-class entertainment, very quickly adopted the Hays Code, and you had all kinds of crazy restrictions on them. Going the wrong way. These are some of the performers of the 50s. This is Jenny Lee, who started our museum. This is Miss Topsy, which 1958, so she was one of the few Black performers that were performing as striptease artists. In the up until World War II, there weren't any. It was really at the beginning of, well, just after the war, that taste and changing social mores started to sort of look for this. They were often very highly exoticized, even so. And for instance, there's another Black performer, who's literally the first performer in the United States to perform on Black performer on an integrated stage as the lead of an integrated stage. But she was billed as this CP of Sally Rand. So everyone knew Sally Rand was this great fan dancer, whatever. So she was this CP, she was the Black version of that. So, there was still this sense of it being marked that they were these exotic beauties, whatever. But she actually, we thought she had passed. Like it's very hard to find something about someone who calls herself Miss Topsy, by the way, because the character in Aaron Beecher Stowe's novel, whose name is just escaped my brain. The little lady who started the big war, the Civil War novel. Anyone? Yeah.
Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yeah. Uncle Tom's Cabin. Sorry, I don't know why that just left my brain. But Topsy is a character in that novel. So if you go and Google Topsy, you're going to get a lot of Uncle Tom's Cabin and not very much this one performer from the late 1950s. But out of nowhere, a few years ago, this guy emails me. He's like, my grandmother was known as Miss Topsy, and I'd love to find pictures of her and find out anything about her. And I contacted him, and she was in the hospital then, and she's still alive. And we were able to go out and have someone go out and record an interview with her. We had a couple of people record interviews with her, and she passed away last year, but But that was really cool. This is Elise St. Cyr, who used to perform at the El Rancho back when Vegas was baby. And was a huge part of our early Las Vegas performance. And this is Jennifer. Oh, it's in my brain, Jennifer Flowers from the Clinton scandal. Jennifer Fox. Jennifer Fox was possibly like the third ever sex reassignment surgery person. Like we know Christine Jorgensen. Jennifer Fox was like right after that. Billed herself as the isn't she or isn't he girl. Yeah, so you can see like this history includes a lot of stuff. You know, there's a lot of LGBTQ history, there's a lot of racial history, there's a lot of working class history. So one of the things that really attracted to me to it is that as an anthropologist, as someone who's looking at sort of wider cultural issues, I could see all this stuff coming together in this one field, and itself being a marginalized field. Like it's already not mainstream because it's about this, you know, this field that is marginalized in our society. So it's one of the things that really drew me to it. These are some of our contemporary performers. This is Dirty Martini. This is Evil Hate Monkey. As you can see, like there's a lot of weird performance art stuff, a lot of circus art stuff, a lot of craziness. This is Connie Coconuts, who's one of our locals who won our Miss Exotic World Pageant 2009 and lives here in Las Vegas. And this is a group that was called Rubenesque Burlesque. This at Fat Camp, they kill and eat a skinny girl. So it's fun for the whole family, really. So, you know, burlesque has really changed. So Anthropology Museum. So from there into you know, something that's me. This is probably more of interest to you guys. So anthropology's always been in museums. You know, from Franklin Hamilton Cushing worked in the Zuni, was on assignment from the Smithsonian. Franz Boas, of course, worked at the Field Museum and started there at the Graphic Collection and then moved to the American Museum of Natural History. Alfred Kroeber at the Phoebe Hearst Museum, where he hosted and or captured Ishi. Many of you know that story. William Sturtevant was the founder of or not founder, but he was a major figure at the American Museum of Natural History, which is the department where the National Museum of Natural History, which is the museum where I did where I was attached for my fellowship. It has I think an important history for the history of anthropology in terms of, you know, the development of anthropological thought, and Boas particularly rejecting the cultural evolutionism and coming up with this more particularist, relativist way of looking at cultures and understanding them as collections of things, including songs and beliefs and practices and so on, that had to be understood all together in one context. And that's an insight from his work in museums and not so much necessarily from his work in the field. And Kroeber's humanism, but also maybe not. So it's hard to know what to make of Kroeber 100 years on and in relationship with Ishi, so anthropologists have always worked in museums, and the reason is because our training is uniquely good, especially for most of the people here, which, you know, you're focused much more on archaeology than mine was, but looking at objects and figuring out stuff about people with them. I often say my job is I tell stories with objects. When I talk about museums in a minute, I even have a slide that says that. So telling stories with objects means you know, it's not always the story, it's often an object tells many, many stories, but that's what we do in museums. We put a bunch of these objects together and try to make some kind of sense, some kind of narrative that you can learn from. And I think anthropology is uniquely suited for that. So what's a museum? This is the International Committee on Museums definition that they spent like 8 years working out because the people kept objecting to their definitions. So it's less vague than the one they had 10 years ago, but it's still pretty loose. Not for profit, there are for-profit museums, so already people are going to object to that. A permanent institution in service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. It's open to the public, accessible and inclusive. People don't like it when you tell them their places have to be accessible and inclusive. By the way, we're not in this debate. Museums foster diversity. They don't like when I tell you you're fostering diversity. And sustainability. They operate and communicate ethically, professionally with the participation of their communities, offering varied experiences for education, enjoyment, reflection, and knowledge sharing. So there's a lot of stuff to unpack in there, and I don't have time to unpack it all, but basically the important thing is it's an educational institution, and both of those words are important. We have a job to educate people, but it is an institution. It's not a class, it's not a online, you know, lecture, or webinar. It's not, you know, it's an institution. It's a structure of some kind, social structure of some kind. We use objects to tell stories. It's embedded in a community, and that's really, really important and something a lot of museums forget about. That we exist. Traditionally, museums were like, oh, you know, we're for 8 scholars. You know, the British Museum, you had to apply in advance for, you know, to even go into it up through the end of the 19th century. But we are part of a community. We're part of a bunch of communities. So we're part of the Las Vegas community. We're part of the burlesque community. Those don't necessarily have the same interests, and we often are at odds. We're also part of the museum community, and there's another set of interests that are often at odds. When I became the executive director, my mandate was sort of to professionalize and make sure that our collection would last, because it had not been treated well. It had never been cataloged. It had never been, you know, no one had ever done like basic, you know, just keeping it clean even. People would try stuff on in the old museum and stuff like that. A lot of people didn't like that I came along and was like, no. If we want this stuff to last for another generation, let alone for forever, like we have to have better practices. And people didn't like it because the museum practices are very orderly and structured, and people like the kind of DIY punk aesthetic of, you know, a couple of strippers starting a museum in the middle of the desert. And I get that, you know, like I like that too. I just have a responsibility to some stuff and to a community that is longer term than that. And it's a leisure activity. People forget this a lot in museums as well. But, you know, people are coming to learn, but people are coming to have fun. And we try very hard to make sure that our tours are super fun and that people go away with like stuff in their head that's maybe gonna nag at them. Like maybe, you know, women having their own sexual autonomy isn't such a bad thing. So that's the one I said. So this is sort of my definition of social institution for telling stories to display of objects. This is one of the masks over at the Barrack Museum, the Mexican dance masks. The work consists of 100,000 things. And I work in a very small museum where we have 4 staff members. We have a curator, we have a program coordinator, and we have a museum assistant. And everything they don't do, I do. We do have some volunteers, and the big event that we do is like 60 volunteers that put that together. They're all over, but there's some of them even out of the country, but most of them are all over the country. The work that's most relevant to anthropology is the programming stuff, curating a collection, both putting it, putting together your collection, of what are these items that need to be preserved and for our mission, but also putting together exhibitions. What are the objects in our collections that can be used to tell a specific story, like the story of Kobe He or the story of Burlesque. Subject matter experts, not all of them have it, but a lot of museums will have like a paleontologist on staff or an archaeologist or whatever, just to be someone that knows this material. And a lot of these roles are double, triple, quadruple over. Exhibition design, curators select objects. Some of them are good at exhibition design, but increasingly exhibitions are designed by designers using the items that curators select. Collection management, making sure the collection is registered into a catalog, that we know what's in there, that we know where it is. And then conservation, making sure that it's maintained and kept up. In art museums, and you can find gazillion YouTube videos of them conserving paintings by like removing old varnish or filling in places that are broken. History museums don't tend to do that as much. It's much more about preserving things in the condition that they're in, because the condition that they're in is part of their story. Registration is literally putting things in the catalog. That's often conflated with collection management. Education. Now we have a bunch of exhibitions, a bunch of objects. We need to teach people about them. Museums shouldn't be just you walk in and you read a bunch of labels and you leave. Museums have programs. They often have programs like tours that are oriented for a bunch of different ages. They often have other programs like side programs for kids or for school groups or for whatever. That's the education department. Interpretation is closely related to that. When we give a tour, we are doing interpretation of the objects. And often there's a head of interpretation whose job it is to kind of spell out how are we going to interpret things. We put on special events, which could be anything from a lecture to a film screening to parties, nights at the museum type things. Brooklyn Museum has raves, outreach and social media, that material to tell stories online and to get that material out in the community, and visitor experience, which is the literal you walk in, you pay someone, there's like a person there, there's a person in the store, there's people in the galleries telling you, putting you around, whatever. That's all visitor experience. Administration, which is technically my job, although I do most of this stuff as well. But you have to manage your budget and finances. The world doesn't want to give museums a lot of money, and so you have to figure out how to get by. Human resource and staff management, strategic planning, what do we want to accomplish and how are we going to accomplish it over the next X number of years? Marketing, advertising, public relations, government, corporate relations, legal compliance. I do a lot of this. It sucks. Stuff like making sure we file our 990s and our annual reports to the state. And I just got noticed our business license has to be renewed. Board relations. Most museums are nonprofits. Nonprofits are weird because you have a board, you answer to a board of people who don't know anything about museums and often don't know anything about the subject matter. I happen to have a board that's a bunch of people that know a lot about burlesque, but that's not always the case. Often it's like there's some banker in the community and some guy that runs a brokerage and a lawyer, and they don't know anything about dinosaurs or medieval art or whatever it is, but you're still answerable to them at some level because nonprofits are owned by the community and the board represents the people. You have policy and procedures to write and maintain and enforce. You have facilities to manage. Your trash has to be taken out. The pipes need to work. All that stuff. Bathrooms need to be clean. Security, and then fundraising. Again, how do you get money? Donor cultivation research. Keeping those donors and make sure that they're feel like they're part of what you do. You have membership programs. Events also, which can be raise money for the museum. Someone has to write grants. I do that. I don't like it, but I do it. Sponsorships, corporate sponsorships. Fulfillment, making sure that the terms of those sponsorships or other, if a donor says, I'm gonna give you $100,000 to do this, then you do that, make sure you do that. And the museum store, these are all ways of raising funds. Some of the challenges facing museums right now, and I only have a few minutes. DIA is the biggest one. Museums are traditionally white middle class. Something like 80% of museum workers are women, but something like 70-ish% of museum leadership is male. These are all issues that need to be dealt with. What to do with human remains. We've all seen the thing, I think, in a few weeks from the the Smithsonian. They're like, oh, we've got these 200 Dallas heard like a collection. It's like 200 skulls that were just taken, no permission, nothing. So all that stuff, big ethical issues around that. Looted material collections, same thing. And again, the Bible Museum had to send back thousands of pieces because they're all looted from Iraq and Turkey and whatever during wars and whatnot. Establishing relevance, letting people know that museums are important. Our relationships with the people represented. A lot of natural history museums have displays, ethnographic displays, and not have relationships with the people whose stuff is in there. So that's changing, but it's a big challenge. There are too many museum studies grads. There are not enough jobs. It's unfortunate, but true. Financial hardship in the wake of COVID-19, especially the digital transition. What happens when you put all your collection on? Do people still want to come in and online? Do people still want to come in and see it? And the politicization the last few years of, museums having to take down exhibits because they're state funded and they talk about gay people in their exhibits or whatever. The strengths of the things that we have, museums are the #1 most trusted institution for, knowledge, facts in the United States. We're like 95% trusted. Whereas like the press is like 55%, your government is like 12%. And most people think museums are good. And that is me at a museum in California, and there's steps. That's it. 5 minutes shorter. We have what, 3 minutes for questions? Yeah.
I have one, just because of your discussion about being part of a community. You're in Las Vegas, which is helpful, I'm sure, but have you had pushback from people?
Less than I would have thought, and I've been both happy and sad about that. Happy because I don't really want to deal with it. Sad because it would do us a lot of good in terms of traffic to have, CNN be like, 100 people protested in front of the Burlesque Hall of Fame today saying that they were dirty, nasty strippers, and here's Dustin Wax talk about why they're not. That would be great for us. But we did have one run in just recently, a group called Open the Books, which is a right-wing watchdog group. They're basically like the government wasting all its money on stupid stuff like poetry classes in some college or whatever. The president of this, or the chair of this organization, has a weekly segment on one of the local news channels, and they did a report looking at what Las Vegas nonprofits had gotten COVID funding. And like Salvation Army got like $19 million, and Catholic Charities got like $24 million. We got $36,000 from Institute of Museum and Library Studies to digitize our collection. And part of that was put a big chunk of our collection online and make it searchable. So we've done that. We have like 800 pictures, 800 pieces that have been photographed in our collection online, and you can go there and look at this stuff. Part of this is my fault. There were a couple of nudes, topless pictures, and we probably should have taken them out before we put them online. Although, you can also go to the grocery store and buy the swimsuit issue, and that has nudity in it. Like there's perfume ads and everything. I like it, and it's not porn. Like it's not even close. These are promo pictures that were meant to be displayed. So Anyway, so he did his segment and they did an article and they were like, you know, like I said, hundreds of millions of dollars that went to these nonprofits here in or maybe $100 million. And our $36,000 was all they focused on, so that we could share pornography online. And I wrote to the organization because they contacted me for comment beforehand. And I wrote this really long, well thought out piece that then in the piece they didn't even mention. I wrote to the news channel, never got a response. And I wrote to our community. I'm like, hey, we're under attack. People, you know, nothing ever came out of it because fortunately for us, just as museums and every other good thing in society have lost a lot of relevance, and people are just staying home and watching Netflix, nobody watches the local news either. So I don't know how many people saw it. But we haven't gotten, you know, I mean, and it's something we're always aware of that could happen, you know. Anytime we get a little bit of press, it's like, well, that could be the thing that sets people off, because we've seen it happen for a library that puts, you know, a book about gay penguins on the shelf or whatever, you know, and all of a sudden there's, you know, Fox News blathering on about it. So, anyone else?
We're a couple minutes over our time, but if there are other questions, comments, we can also filter out into the hall and talk about that as well.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for having me.